Hey guys, so this video is probably going to be quite short and sweet, nothing too deep, but hopefully it'll be somewhat thought-provoking and it'll manage to spark a discussion down in the comment section. I'm hoping this video will get people talking and it will lead us to some really interesting takes and ideas. So basically, yesterday at work I was daydreaming, as I so often do when I'm at work, and I was trying to think of new ideas for videos, and then the thought popped into my head that the Second Galactic Empire in All Tomorrows was founded after first contact was established between just two of the future human species, those two being the Killer Folk and the Satyriacs. So for anyone who doesn't know, the Second Galactic Empire is an intergalactic federation made up of the worlds which are inhabited by the sapient, civilized, evolved forms of the animalistic future human species which were made by the Q. Now, I don't know why, but I find it quite appropriate that these two species, the Killers and the Satyriacs, would be the first to contact each other, and also the fact that they seem to have gotten along so well, or at the very least well enough to establish an alliance with each other. I feel that these two species probably have an awful lot in common with one another, in that they don't strike me as being, I suppose you could say, particularly inhibited. Now, what I mean by that is I feel like these two species would be highly in touch with what you could call their more primal instincts, in slightly different ways of course. So for example, it states in the book that the Killer Folk had a multitude of religions over their species' lifetime, and within those religions they would have had sacred times that were dedicated to things like murderous orgies that would be comprised of sex, death and prayer. It seems that the Killer Folk were very much in tune with their bloodlust and didn't really shy away from it the way we modern humans do, and it seems that even into their highly developed stages of civilization they still set aside times in which they could engage in ritualized hunts and killing games. The Satyriacs, on the other hand, were again highly in tune with their primal instincts, but, and this is just a guess, theirs would probably involve much less killing, though they would have, like the Killers, still been extremely fond of orgies, though the death aspect would be much less prevalent. Maybe it would have been there in some ways, as the Satyriacs strike me as being extremely free in their attitudes to such things, basically having a whatever floats your boat mentality. As long as it's all consensual, then you do you. You want to kill each other, go ahead, as long as everyone agrees to it. Now I know that by the time these two races were advanced enough to be able to contact one another, which was done long distance via radio communication by the way, they would likely have left a lot of this behaviour in the past, and the Killer Folk wouldn't do nearly as much killing by that point. But upon first contact with one another, I think that one of the first things that these two future human species would have discussed would have been their respective species' histories. Now I believe it says in the book that by this point the evolved sapient future human species, and not just the Killers and the Satyriacs but the others as well, so the Pterosapiens, the Saurosapiens, the tall breeders, etc., had all by this point learned all about or figured out their history. They've learned about the Star People and what happened with the Q, all of that. So they would probably have theorised that there were many others like them out there amongst the stars, and so when they received their initial first communication, whether it was the Killers contacting the Satyriacs or vice versa, they would have already known that the beings they were speaking to were in fact their distant cousins. So I think that's what their very first conversations would have been about, you know, their ancestors being these star-faring humans from millions of years ago. They originated on a planet that they called Earth, which at this point was lost and nobody knew exactly where it was. Oh, you're descended from Star People? Hey, us too, that's cool. Then they probably would have asked each other a lot of questions, like, have you seen any recent signs of the Q in your vicinity? Nope. What about you? Nope. Thank God. They would have, on each of their worlds, a lot of stuff that was left behind by the Q, notably their pyramid structures. The two species would have probably exchanged any information that they had gleaned from the ruins, anything that they had managed to decipher, to try and get a clearer picture of what happened all those millions of years ago. Once they had discussed the ancient Q and Star People at length and learned all that they could from one another about that subject, they would have moved on to other things, so along with learning about each other's history, they would want to learn about each other's present. So they would have exchanged descriptions of their physical appearance and lifestyle, which in reality wasn't too different from one another, at least when you compare them to the Snake People or the Tall Breeders, who were drastically different from their human ancestors, and from the Killers and Satyriacs too. The Killers and Satyriacs were both bipedal, they lived on dry land and not underwater or within tightly compacted tunnels like the Snake People. They also didn't fly around in the sky like the Pterosapiens. So in a way, I suppose it would have been been easier for these two future human species to be one another's first exposure to another future human race, as the culture shock, and undoubtedly there would have been a culture shock to some extent, it would be less so than if the killer folk's first exposure to other future humans was the snake people instead of the Satyriacs. Now, I know that the killers at this point were highly evolved and technologically way ahead of anything that we have currently, and of course they would have known that any beings that they meet could be extremely different to themselves. It would probably have been much easier for them to meet for the first time another species that had more similarities to themselves rather than differences, and maybe, possibly, the success of the Second Galactic Empire's founding could be due to this. You know, it would have eased them into it, so to speak. If their first contact was with a species that was drastically different to themselves, like the asymmetric people for example, maybe it would have been much harder for them to build that rapport, to establish a real connection. And so maybe the fact that the killer folk and the Satyriacs had more similarities than differences, and they certainly would have had quite a few differences, maybe it was their mostly being similar that could be credited with the Second Galactic Empire being founded in the first place. Then, once they had gotten used to each other, meeting others that were even more different to themselves would have been much easier for them. So those are just some thoughts on how I feel the first contact between the killer folk and the Satyriacs would have played out, though it's really just scratching the surface. There is much more that can be said about this topic, but I'm just going to leave it there for now. I'm really interested in seeing what you guys come up with in regards to this, what you feel they may have talked about, what their initial reactions to each other may have been. There's all kinds of directions it could go, so sound off in the comments below and let me know what you think. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this video somewhat enjoyable. This has been Beware the Q, and I'll see you in the next video.